No, 5 and 6.
Whatever.
I just ran them out there.
Make it a little shorter.
Basketball here when I was a kid.
And then why? Yeah. Okay, crowded building. Do we have 30 seconds? Actually, right now. Then I can get it back.
One, two. We're going to get started in just a moment because we have all of an hour and we have an illustrious panel. And they got a lot of stuff to say to all of us this afternoon. So I hope everyone had a good lunch. If you can find a seat quickly. And we're going to start in just, it is 1:32. I got a great little clock in front of me. We're going to just start in about 30 seconds to a minute, and we're going to take a journey together. We're going to take a journey into diaspora. So let me introduce myself. My name is Rabbi Bob Kaplan. I am the executive director of something called the Center for a Shared Society. It is the intergroup, interfaith, community building division of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York. and I've had an interesting day so far. I started, well, part of diaspora. It's an interesting part of diaspora. For those who have never been to Borough Park in Brooklyn, I really suggest you go one day. You're going to see a whole lot of folks that are a miracle that they're existing today, because each and every one of them are either themselves or a child or a grandchild or a great-grandchild of a Holocaust survivor. People who came out of an attempt to wipe out a diaspora, yet they survived. And where were we? We were in a matzah bakery. It's called the Borough Park Matzah Bakery. They were making handmade matzahs there. Those who have ever had it, it's called shmura matzah, guarded wheat, and it's a special type of round handmade matzah. And we brought a group of both Christian and Muslim leaders there today to see the process, and some other Jewish leaders to see the process that has lasted for thousands of years. This is not something new. This has been part of our diaspora, the journey of the diaspora, the preservation of culture, of telling a story that happened thousands of years ago. Passover will start on Monday evening. That's part of our journey. But that's historical and intentional, because it says right there in the Bible, and I hope I'm not stealing anyone's thunder, is it says, you shall tell your children when. Well, that's an important part of the journey into diaspora. But being a rabbi, we always tell stories, and we illustrate journeys together through stories. And I'll tell you a much more modern story of a interface between, well, one of my dearest friends in the world. His name is Mohammed Razvi. He's a leader in the South Asian community in Brooklyn. He runs the largest not-for-profit serving the South Asian and the Central Asian community in Brooklyn. Started literally weeks after 9/11. And we were brought into the United Kingdom by the British Foreign Service to meet with different groups doing shared society work there. He is a Shiite Muslim, and he wanted to go meet with one of his Ayatollahs. Now, I'm of a generation where the word Ayatollah does not always slip easily off the tongue here as an American. It's just culturally media-based bias that has been implanted in my brain, that we always have to deal with our both unconscious and implicit biases all the time. And the trick is to become more conscious of them. However, there I was sitting in front of this Ayatollah. He's looking at me, Rabbi. I'm looking at him, Ayatollah, and we're a little uncomfortable with each other. But my friend Mohammed, is having a great time because he's getting to talk to a spiritual teacher. What a wonderful experience, because Mo, originally born in Karachi, grew up most of his life in Brooklyn, now one of the main leaders helping to preserve his world in Brooklyn, in a certain part of Brooklyn called Flatbush, was happy to be in the presence of a spiritual teacher. And then one of the sons of the Ayatollah walks in, and we have a terminology in the Jewish world, in the Orthodox Jewish world in particular, it's called off the derech, off the path. Those who have stepped away a little bit because they don't want to remain within the traditional pathways that we tend to live. And his kid was one of them. He had a couple of piercings, a couple of tattoos. His clothes wasn't exactly what an Ayatollah's kid normally wears. But the father obviously really loved his son. He embraced him and he talked to him. And, he was a little uncomfortable in front of strangers, seeing that the kid didn't exactly fit into all the norms that he would have loved his son to fit into, but he loved his son. His son leaves, father sits down again, and I, who have an older son who was a little bit of one of those as well, leaned into him. I said, "So you got one too, huh?" And he looks at me with a startled look on his face, and everything of the rabbi, the Ayatollah, the Middle East, all the Muslim-Jewish divide, all that stuff disappeared, and he goes to me, "How do you deal with it?" How do you deal with a Western culture that is so enticing, that was pulling his son away from a pathway that he wanted his son to follow? How do you deal with a different world, a different language, a different set of music, a different set of culture, a different set of art, a different set of frame of reference? How do you deal with it? How do you walk that pathway of diaspora? For 12 years, I taught at the City University of New York, CCNY, one of its august branches. I taught a course called the Jewish Immigrant Experience. There aren't many Jews that go to CCNY anymore because they used to, in large numbers as an immigrant population. Other immigrant groups are there now. And they were all part of my class. And originally I used to ask them, why are you here? What are you doing in a class about the Jewish immigrant experience? You're obviously not from my religious or faith community. And almost always they would say, we understand you guys came here because you had to, because you were being chased out of another place. Or we understand a little bit about that, but we want to know how you've made it. How did you become part and parcel of New York, the American scene, and how do you stay who you are? So that's what we're here to do this morning. So our panel, as I said, will self-introduce themselves. They'll give you 5 or 6 minutes of looking at the notion of diaspora. In other words, having to leave, sometimes willfully, often unwillfully, from the place that has been the fountain and the foundation of who and what you are, to go to some other place, to have the Ayatollah look at me. How do you deal with it? So we're going to start at the other end, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot first, but please self-identify yourselves. Let's hear a little bit about your journey.
Thank you so much. I think it's interesting we start with me after that wonderful opening, because I am a product of the diaspora rather than someone who left and had to rebuild as my parents did. But my name is Irada Kashgari. Salam alaikum, and hello, good afternoon, everybody. First and foremost, I want to thank the organizers for having me here today. It's an honor to be able to speak on behalf of my work, as well as be a representative of the youth, as I'd like to think, and to communicate how great things are being done by not only the youth, as we consider, which is 20 and above, 18 and above, but the younger generation, the next generation of kids that are being born in America, that are being born in the diaspora, and how they're building. A little bit about my background. I am the founder of Ana Care in Education alongside my mom. So Ana Care means mother's care, right? Ana means mother in Uyghur, and I think that's a very poignant part to start with, because I think a lot of the diaspora at the end of the day starts at the home. I think it really begins at the family level, and then it can spread to the community level. We started our school back in 2017, and we've been pretty successful after growing from 30 students to about a little over 100, and our events generally have a 200, 300 person turnout, which is really great, knowing that, that's not normally the case, because at the end of the day, activism and the Uyghur issue is a very, very sensitive topic for a lot of people. I think some of the reasons that made us pretty successful are that we had a good location, because we're based off of Fairfax, Virginia, and that is a great gathering place just because we have a lot of the community. It's easily accessible. We have amazing teachers who have given up a lot, and then most of all, our parents, who we have a core set of parents that give up not just once a week, but during the week, they make sure that their kids are doing their homework, that they are being enticed, that they are appreciating what they're being taught on Sunday school. The reason we started this school, I think, is because back in 2016, I had an event with both people my age as well as people younger, and I said, how many of you guys told other people when they ask where are you from, that you tell them you're Turkish? And the response to that was shocking, because I think almost everybody laughed and raised their hands. This is a room full of Uyghur people saying that they are telling other people when they ask, where are you from, that they're Turkish. While we're similar, that's not who we are. We can't point to the map and say, Turkey is where I'm from, and if a Turkish person comes to speak to us, we're gonna struggle because we don't speak Turkish at the end of the day. And I think this is one of the main reasons that these schools are so important and that these local communities really need to invest in their youth because of the fact that in China right now, in East Turkestan, they are tearing our Uyghur culture away. They are making us afraid to say that we're Uyghur. We can't do that in the diaspora. That's not something we can continue here. That's something we need to be very, very poignant in avoiding. The other is, what is your name? Right now I said Irade Kashkari, but when you ask my American friends, they'll say, oh, Irade, they'll pronounce it differently. So one of the other aspects is, what is in a name? What is the identity in a name? And how do we maintain that for our kids? How do we make sure that we have created a space for the next generation to be proud of the name, of their name, of the way that it's pronounced, the way that it is said? We want to create a future generation that these questions are not uncomfortable for. What have we seen overall is in our schools with these kids, what we've seen is that our schools, beyond just the students and classes, it's incorporating the generational knowledge and a place where families can come together for more than just education, right? It starts with knowing the language. It starts with knowing the culture. It starts with knowing the history. But it's not just our love for dance and music and sports. We have those, but why are those so important to us? How are they impacting us now, and how did they impact us in the past? And what are these history classes and these language classes add that extra layer of why it's so important? And these kids can understand it. I think we generally tend to underestimate children a lot of the times, but they understand the layers. They see their parents crying because they can't communicate with their family members back home. They understand that while everybody else goes to see their grandparents and cousins and uncles and aunts, that they're unable to do that. And that impacts how they view their Uyghur identity vastly. The other aspect is passing the torch. So I know we're surrounded by a great amount of activists here, and I'd like to ask, who do you think is going to take up your torch when you are done with it? Who are you going to pass your torch on to? And that's going to be that next generation. We're not all here forever. This fight will be going on for a while, and we will eventually have to have kids who are educated in the language and the culture enough to be able to go back to East Turkestan and be able to teach those kids that are currently being prevented from learning anything. And that's the responsibility of the diaspora, is that having that idea that we will eventually have to go back and help educate those kids that are being torn apart from their culture and from their Uyghurness.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Doctor?
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon. I'm honored to be here today. We, the Uyghurs, are grateful to the Elevation Foundation for Humanity for sponsoring and organizing this very important conference, along with our Uyghur organizations. I just want to start with telling you a little bit about Uyghur American, history of the Uyghur American, and then touch upon our Uyghur Academy's current work. So I'm a president of Uyghur Academy, Global Uyghur Academy, and senior advisor for World Uyghur Congress, and I was also a founder of Uyghur American Association. So we, myself, and my friend sitting there, Dr. Erkin Siddiq, we came to the United States in late 1980s. Mainly for study, grad school, PhDs. So we did our studies, and at that time, in late 80s, early 90s, there's not many Uyghurs, but they are spread out throughout the United States. All over the more than 20 states, we have about 40, 50 Uyghurs. So we found this Uyghur American Association. The reason we call it Uyghur American is this will be the home for the Uyghur in America. So all the Uyghur come to United States will become American. So basically, we held first Uyghur Congress and democratically elected the board of directors for the Uyghur American, first Uyghur American Association. Because under the Chinese regime, our people doesn't know about democracy. Basically, that's first practice we had. Democratically volunteered themselves, and with that democratic election, we elected. Basically, we have about 40, 50 who attended the first Uyghur Congress, and about 19 people volunteered, nominated themselves. So overwhelmingly, basically, we have elected about 9 people. So basically, this Uyghur American Association, we have been passing along every 2-3 years of democratic election. Currently, to our next generation, our talented leader, the president of Uyghur American Association, El-Tibar, El-Fadr, basically will be speaking in the next panels. So that is our basically home for Uyghur American. And shortly after we established Uyghur American Association, and my colleagues, Alim Setov and myself, we knocked NED door, met with Louis Griever, and also Mr. Karl Goshman, their colleagues, basically introducing the Uyghurs to the National Endowment for Democracy. Basically, our goal was to be voice for the Uyghurs, for the voiceless people back home, and also unite Uyghur in the United States and also in the diaspora. Eventually, we also formed Uyghur Academy that was founded in 2009. And since 2017, as the world has been witnessed, Chinese Communist Party has been conducting active and ongoing genocide, targeting Uyghur and as a Turkic people in our homeland, East Turkestan. So that brings to the challenges of preserving our culture and the language. So Uyghur Academy has been active, promotes collaboration among Uyghur community, organization, university, and the government. Basically, last year we had a global conference in Ankara on preservation of Uyghur culture and the promotion of Uyghur language. As that conference attended by more than 30 organizations representative from more than 50 countries. Basically, so that conference, we discussed the current situation and also our, Uyghur has been being an Uyghur voice. Dr. Adrian Zhang was there past 5-6 years, has been pulling out the evidence, showing the evidence of the genocide the Chinese government has been doing to the Uyghur. So we had this conference and workshop followed by a 2-week summer school. So we discussed the challenges, opportunity, and the mechanism how we preserve Uyghur culture and our identity and Uyghur language. So one of the key areas we identified at the conference is to learn from as a community, like heritage learning. So today's panel provides good opportunity for us to learn from the Jewish community. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. Carl.
Thanks, Rushat. And I spoke on the topic of this panel when we met, at the conference of GW 16 months ago, December 2022. I spoke on this, and my remarks were published in Tablet, which is a Jewish online journal. You can read it. I'm not going to talk about that today. And I'm not going to talk about that today, not just because I wrote about it and you can read it, but because the world has changed drastically since then. Rabbi Kaplan said, what is the prism? What is the idea that through which you're going to talk about this subject today? And I said, the idea I'm going to talk about is trauma. Trauma. That since October 7th, the Jewish community has gone through trauma. And everyone in Israel has gone through trauma. And what is that trauma? The trauma is the return, not just Jews helping Uyghurs because we experienced the Holocaust. Our people experienced the Holocaust, but it seems to be happening again today, or at least that's the intention. And this has caused trauma. That's what happened on October 7th, when Hamas slaughtered more Jews than were killed on any single day since the Holocaust. And they did so in the most gruesome way. An article in the New York Times recently talked about the weaponization of sexual violence, the rape, the mutilation, the extreme brutality toward women. But it was shocking. And unlike the Chinese, Hamas doesn't hide its genocidal vision. It's defined in its charter. It's the most genocidal charter of any organization in the whole world. And what happened on October 7th was a pre-enactment of that genocidal vision. And it's had profound and traumatic consequences. And beyond that, and I think this is a point that Soraya Dean started this conference with, there has been a kind of a surge of global anti-Semitism. And what's shocking about this surge of global anti-Semitism is that the touchstone of this new anti-Semitism is the charge that it is Israel that is committing genocide against the Palestinians. Genocide until October 7th was a relatively obscure term, technical almost, defined in the Genocide Convention. Since then, it has become virtually a household word because the campaign against Israel is so broad. But my point to you today, and this is the second of 4 points that I'm going to make, my point to you today is that this is all a lie. That the key thing about genocide is intent. Hamas declared its intent in its charter. Israel has made perfectly clear that its intent is to destroy Hamas, not the Palestinian people. There's a big, big, big difference there. And what they're doing is in self-defense. And they are taking measures to try to avoid civilian casualties, even though Hamas has embedded itself in the civilian population and has built a tunnel network longer than the London Tube, beneath homes and mosques and hospitals and schools from which they fight their battle. And so it's very, very hard to avoid civilian casualties. No, I'm going to finish. You went on a long time, too. I want to finish. The ratio of combatant to civilian casualties in Gaza so far, the ratio of, because the figures you have don't distinguish between combatant and civilian, is 1 to 1.5, according to Richard Helms, a former colonel in Britain, as opposed to what the UN says is the normal casualty in war of 1 to 1.9. And so efforts have been made to avoid civilian casualties, alerting the civilian populations to exaggerate. But that what has happened as a result of this, and here I'm quoting from The Economist, and this is my third point, is that the use of the term genocide to describe what Israel is doing has debased the term genocide. And I think Uyghurs have a great stake in not seeing the term genocide debased and distorted. The Economist magazine said that this cheapens the concept of genocide And it also is used by China to be able to say, well, we're against genocide because we're against Israel. It's a very damaging thing to the Uyghur cause. And so what I am, and this is my last point, what I am urging today is for the Uyghurs to consider how they can develop a voice on this issue. They will be asked about it. What do you think about what's happening in Gaza? They will be asked about it because you're fighting genocide. And there's a kind of term, the word genocide, it defines the struggle of the Uyghurs today. How do you find a voice on this? And I want to make a simple proposal that I would like our Uyghur friends to consider as to how they develop their own voice on this kind of an issue when they're asked about it today. And that is that there be a leadership delegation of Uyghurs that goes to both Israel and to an Arab country. The Arabs have not been helpful on this. The Gulf states have not been helpful. They've even supported China. I think if a Uyghur delegation could visit Israel to learn about what's happening there right now and how they're thinking about this and the transformation of the consciousness in Israel and in the diaspora, that would deepen the Uyghur-Jewish relationship. But also, I think, it could help in the relations with the Arabs if there could be a Uyghur delegation that goes to Saudi Arabia or the UAE or one of the Gulf states to start a discussion between Uyghurs and the Arabs so that they understand what the Uyghurs are going through and they understand this debate that's taking place today. So I put that for you. I'd like it to be considered, and I think it's something that could both help the Uyghur cause but also deepen the understanding by the Uyghurs of the Jewish experience.
Thank you. So I was told I need to introduce myself, right? So my name is Rahima Mahmoud. I'm a singer. I'm the UK director of the World Uyghur Congress and executive director of the Stop Uyghur Genocide. But most people know me as a singer, although my full-time job now is as a full-time advocate. I know we don't have a lot of time to talk about the work that we have been doing. I mean, it will take a long, long time to really in depth to explain. But what I want to say is preserving the language, the culture, and especially for me, music. It's like preserving the soul of the Uyghur people. I believe the reason the Chinese government really relentlessly targeting our language, our culture, is because they want to destroy us, our spirit, our soul. People who know Chinese government, not only the CCP, historically, they are the master of the people who can assimilate. Hundreds of ethnic groups disappeared over centuries. And the reason they now targeting the Uyghur people, especially since 2016, because not only because we are the owner of that land, the East Turkestan, but also because we are very different. And we resist. We've been resisting, although not with weapons, but resisting, not giving up about who we are as people. Resisting not speaking the Uyghur language and music, art, poetry. So when I came to the UK in 2000, the very first thing I'm sure most people experienced, almost every Uyghur experienced when people ask, where are you from? We are very reluctant to say from China. When we say that I'm Uyghur, a lot of time people just stares at you and think, what is that? So that's one of the reasons that I co-founded the London Uyghur Ensemble in 2004. And through this music group, we performed in so many different places, including British Museum, British Library, Victoria Albert Museum, Science Museum, and many universities, and many festivals. And through music, telling the story. And that I find that is far more easier than talk about very heartbreaking stories. And we, as you have mentioned about how we should tell our story, it is important when you including art in the story, and that makes people remember you more. It's easier for people to listen and understand, and also feeling inspired. Some people, after hearing a beautiful song, and then you say, if you don't act, this will disappear. And say, oh no, we must act. So it's just very simple example. And also language. My major part of my work involves translation, interpreting. I translated a book called The Land Drenched in Tears, a memoir about the Cultural Revolution, and also poems. Last night when I performed at the art gallery for the reception, and I read out the poem of Gülnisa Emin, and I know many people cried. Because that is the power of art, that's the power of poems, that's power of music. So it really played a really important, crucial role, with my activism work, how it, to attract substantial base of supporters. And also through our expressive performance of some melancholic melodies and occasionally uplifting tunes. We not only share our stories, including the deep pain, but also assert our demand for transformative change from those in position of authority. So in the face of the Chinese CCP crime, that relentless attempts to completely eradicate our essence of Uyghurness. So I always say expressing joy becomes a genuine act of resistance. So one more point, I agree with Irada, and how we pass this to our next generation. And I just want to say the Tarim Network, for example, co-founded by my son and Zubaira's daughter. I would invite people to look at their work. I'm immensely proud of my son, leading these two young youth, leading this really important work. And I think that is something that I feel that this is going to continue. Thank you.
My name is Mark Hetfield. I'm the president and CEO of HIAS, which is the Jewish Community's International Refugee Agency. We were established here in New York over 120 years ago to assist Jews who were fleeing from the diaspora to the United States, fleeing pogroms, anti-Semitism, hatred, primarily in Eastern Europe as well as the Middle East. And we would greet them here in the United States and help them get settled and integrated into their new life. There's an expression in Judaism, may you live to be 120, which was the age that Moses was when he died just before reaching the Promised Land. And we're 121, so we're already past that, kind of living on borrowed time, but we still have a lot of work to do. And I think it's a great honor to be here because there is so much that the Uyghur community and the Jewish community can learn from each other as communities that are associated both with an ethnicity and a faith, and as communities that really have to thrive in diaspora. The key to the Jewish community's survival is that in diaspora is that we have been united by Torah and by our holy book and the traditions, whether we're believers or not, that come from that book, that unite us as a people and kept us alive as a community in exile. And while HIAS is 121 years old, I've been working for HIAS since 1989, so for 35 years. I've quit 3 times, but I always come back. And in 1989, it was a great honor because my work was as a caseworker in Rome, where we were helping Jews who were fleeing the Soviet Union, and Soviet Jews had basically undergone a cultural genocide, a 7-decade campaign to cleanse the Soviet Union of the Jewish traditions that were so rich in all 15 of the Soviet republics at that time. And it was such a great honor to be involved in reuniting Jewish refugees with Judaism in a positive way. As Natan Sharansky said, one of the most famous refuseniks, he said that being a Jew in the Soviet Union was having a birth defect. There was nothing positive about being Jewish in the Soviet Union, and in exile, once they left, we were able to reintroduce them to all the beautiful aspects of being part of the Jewish people. We've made a lot of mistakes over the last 121 years, so you can learn from those mistakes. And our work was really challenging because when we started doing our work, there was no refugee convention. There was no universal declaration of human rights. We had to basically just beg for pity, for empathy during the 1920s, the 30s, the 40s, the genocide that Jews in Europe had to endure to try to get countries to accept Jewish refugees because they had no obligation to do so under international law. Now we, as a minority group, and you, as a minority group, we have to rely on international human rights law to make our case for protection, not just for ourselves, but for anybody who needs that protection. And that's why an alliance between minority groups is just so important under that rubric. In fact, HIAS, we often say at HIAS that we used to help refugees because they were Jewish. Today we help refugees because we are Jewish. And we don't just do that because it's the right thing to do, though it is. We don't just do that because it's part of our faith tradition, though it is. The commandment to welcome the stranger is repeated 36 times in the Torah, more often than any other commandment. But frankly, we also do it for purposes of it's good strategy for our own self-preservation. There's a really important teaching by the Rabbi Hillel, comes from over 2,000 years ago, who said, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, who am I? And if not now, when? And that really is the most important adage by which we all have to live. We have to be for ourselves, but we can't just be for ourselves. We have to have empathy and be for others as well who are in that situation. And that's what guides us through. And that's why HIAS does what it does. And I think it's an important lesson to learn because you cannot protect yourselves as a religious minority, as an ethnic minority, unless you organize within your own community and unless you organize with other communities under the rubric of human rights. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark, and really the whole panel has been very inspiring. My name is Rabbi Asher Lopatin. I'm a modern Orthodox rabbi in Detroit. I have a synagogue, and I'm also the director of community relations at the Greater Ann Arbor Jewish Federation. So, and I was at Detroit for several years, JCRC, really connecting the Jewish community to the broader community. And I think my own identity as a modern Orthodox Jew is part of that. The importance of being proud of being Jewish and being centered on who you are, a little bit like what you said, Mark, and what we've been hearing, and also be concerned for the entire world. I know there are some amazing organizations like Tzedek, which really reflects this, and HIAS, and many others in the Jewish community. And really what I want to say is a couple of points, where I think the history of the Jewish community and Judaism can be very reassuring for the Uyghur community. And I first want to say on this theme, and it'll come back really, I actually happen to agree. Carl, I'm with you politically and all that. However, what I really want to emphasize is that whatever your political view, whatever your views are on global warming, on Israel-Gaza, or on Ukraine, many other issues, you can also be passionate and an advocate for the plight of the Uyghurs in China. So it's not either or. So you can be passionate, you can have the totally opposite opinion of Carl, but still be here, and it's important for us all to advocate for the plight of the Uyghurs and against the genocide of the Uyghurs. And that's sort of what I want to say, that modern Orthodoxy and Judaism teaches you can be part of the world and still hold on to who you are. And so I actually, in that vein, this is something sort of negative that happened. We know the expulsion from Spain in 1492, and then many Jews fled to Portugal, and then in 1497, there was the Inquisition, and they had to live for 100 years as crypto-Jews, as practicing Catholics, because they would be killed if they were found out to be Jewish, but secretly as Jews. And that community for 100 years survived. Then that community actually moved to Amsterdam and founded a very strong, incredible Spanish and Portuguese community in Amsterdam. And they went back to being circumcised. You know, you think that they could forget about, but no, they went back to being circumcised. It went all the rituals. So I want the Uyghur community to know that Jewish history teaches that you can actually amazingly hold on to these important parts of your culture. Sometimes they have to be done secretly. They have to really be cherished, but you can really hold on to it, and they will last, and they will come back. And they've come back for the Jewish people. There are also many crypto-Jews, even today, that are in New Mexico, that are all over, that come back to Judaism and say, you know what? There was something that went on. My grandmother, my great-grandmother lit Sabbath candles, or we wouldn't eat pork for some reason, or we would fast one day a year. Barely knew that these are important parts of Judaism, and that was a way back. So I think the history of Judaism outside, even in very oppressive environments, even in the former Soviet Union, teaches that we call it a pintele yid. We call it a little point of Judaism. So it's a pintele Uyghur, a little bit of the Uyghurs everyone has, and with the right approach, people can come back. And I wanted to mention something very important in the Jewish tradition that enabled people all over the world, in Yemen, wherever they were, to come back, and that is the written culture, the text culture of the Jewish tradition. After the early parts of the Common Era, the Jews had an oral tradition passed down, teacher to student, but then there was a fear that it would be lost. So the Mishnah was written down, and then the Talmud was written down. Then there were codes of Jewish law written down, and up until the contemporary period. And so when there was a fear that things would be lost in the religion, things were written down, and they were able to be maintained by those writings. There was a lot of resistance to it, to the writing down of the Mishnah, writing down of the codes, that maybe this would distort the religion because it's supposed to be an oral, living religion, mimetic, but it really held firm. In fact, in just the last few decades, a very important professor, Chaim Soloveitchik, wrote about the difference, and in a somewhat critical way, about the text culture, that it's so rigid, that it's so strange, and yet Judaism today, much of it, especially in the Orthodox world, and actually in different denominations, is the text culture really holds things together. So if these things are written down carefully, they can really be maintained. My final point is that sometimes it's almost the superficial, talking about celebration, celebratory music, the small things that seem superficial in the religion, like maybe Hanukkah. It's not the most important holiday in Judaism, but yet it is observed by a huge number of Jews in America. It could be small things. It could be wearing a kippah. Some people wear a kippah to give them that identity. I'm so taken by the dopas that are being worn here, and there's, you were telling me there's a Dopa Bayram. There's a 6th of May is a holiday celebrating dopas where Uyghurs, I'm led to believe, wear their dopas, and these sometimes they appear superficial. In the Soviet Union, Simchat Torah was celebrated. One holiday, also not the most important, but very important. So I hope that the Jewish tradition, the fact that people all over throughout history were able to maintain and grow the tradition, and the tradition thrives and is passed down by these different ways, will give our Uyghur brothers and sisters confidence that through your teachings and your celebrations, that the tradition will be alive and will flourish and will continue to have a wonderful impact on our world.
Thank you, and I'm going to sort of start at that point. The celebration of Judaism has really mirrored the country where people live. How a particular holiday, while it may look the same outwardly, many of the songs, many of the music, many of the things really mirror the country where they live. There's an integrative process that happens. So I'd like to ask both Irada and Rahima and Dr. Abbas, as you begin to teach the next generation the beauty of your culture, how are you going to navigate? How are you going to navigate the impact that the culture of the country where you're living, whether it be the UK or the United States or wherever, will have upon that music or that celebration or education or even political? Just briefly, if you can just speak to that.
Yeah, I can speak from my own experience. I think rather than just telling your children what to do, but be an example. And that is so important because they just naturally drawn to it. And my son now starting Duta lesson, and he is having one-to-one Uyghur lessons because he realized that he needed to learn those. He find that I never told him that you must. He lost along the way because he spoke perfectly, but then because there wasn't anyone speaking Uyghur in his circle, gradually he lost it. But now he's getting that back. So I think the most important is as parents and as elders, or we are now the, as Irada said, I mean, they are still the young generation, but we are, I can't say I'm an older generation, but we are a middle-aged generation. So how we make sure that they feel that this is a soul, this is me. I want to be British, but also I want to be Uyghur. And recently I spoke to someone who knows my son very, very well, and she said to me, oh my God, he is so British, but also he is so Uyghur.
Thank you. Please.
That's funny that you say that because I think that was one of the comments that I heard as a youth, that I was so American. So when people saw me, open up an Uyghur school with my mom and get into Uyghur activism, they were quite shocked because they said, oh, she's so American. She's too American to be able to do this. But I think what you gave was a great example of the fact that we do need to have patience, I think. If we set the examples, then eventually the children will come around. They will eventually open their eyes. I didn't speak Uyghurcha perfectly or remotely well up until after high school, maybe late into college. I came back home after school and I thought, this is my community, this is my people. I had a realization at like 24, 25. It took a long time because when I was 16, 15, I was hiding who I was. I wasn't proud about being Uyghur as I became when I was 24, 25 and realizing how important it is to maintain these things. The other thing is based on like the culture, even when we think about things that are very simple, right? And how do we really communicate that with our kids when there's this other Western culture, I think you mentioned, that's kind of enveloping our children and pulling them away from what we thought was culture, is we listen to the kids and we actually let them grow the culture as well and let them incorporate what they know as Western culture into our Uyghur culture or our Jewish culture or whichever culture you are. There can be a mix of it. I'd like to point, like there's a couple of, for example, musicians in America and in Europe that are really into rap music or hip hop music, but they have turned that into an own form of activism. There's particularly one song that talks about the 12 muqam that we're so proud of, but they modernized it so that they can attract the younger children. So instead of thinking that it's these two things pushing away, we can think about youth actually bringing in Western culture and how do we get the Western audience into our culture? How do we get them enticed into our culture and understanding it? And how do we get the next generation after generation to continue to be enticed by the Uyghur culture and realize that there's more?
Thank you so much. Please.
I just want to say from my personal experience, past 35 years, we raised 3 kids in the United States. Basically, of course, they learn the diverse culture in America and also of course, the language in that country. And for the family, for each family, Uyghur or Jewish family, I believe there's the key element of maintaining the culture is the language, the cultural identity, and the history. I think those are the key elements to preserving the culture. Thank you.
Thank you. This pull and tug between cultures is also deeply affected by what Carl spoke about using the word trauma. The Jewish experience is chock full of trauma, whether it be the trauma of the 70 years of the Soviet Union trying to literally drag out of our people. Everyone was expecting, Fiddler on the Roof, Tevye to arrive after 7 years, but it had been dragged out. Or the trauma of the Holocaust, or the trauma that my grandparents went through, or the pogroms when they came to America, or the recent trauma that Carl referred to. Trauma is built into dislocation. It is built into people forcing you out. Just from the Jewish experience, how do we navigate trauma as not being debilitating, but being a way of having spiritual and cultural resilience?
Let me just add, before we break, one final thought on this. Next Tuesday begins the Jewish holiday of Passover. And Passover has a double message for the Uyghurs. On the one hand, and this is what we've talked about and what we're talking about today, there are ways, and this fascinated His Holiness the Dalai Lama, there are ways in which Jews, through things like the Seder on Passover, have educated young people and preserved the culture. That's one issue. But Passover is also a story of freedom, liberation from slavery. And we shouldn't forget that. And as we talk about how Uyghurs can survive in exile, let us also talk about how Uyghurs can be liberated in China, in Xinjiang, in East Turkestan. And I don't give up on that. Xi Jinping and communism is not going to be there forever. We've seen too much of change in this world, and it is not out of the question that there can be a liberation of the Uyghur people in their homeland.
And I'll respond to the rabbi's question, too, about dealing with trauma, because it's something that we have to deal with at HIAS every day, and we have a long history of it, first dealing with the trauma that Jewish refugees experienced, and now the trauma that all refugees we help are experiencing. One is HIAS relies on we don't do the resettlement of refugees in the U.S. by ourselves. We do it in partnership with Jewish Family Service agencies across the country. And these Jewish Family Service agencies were established primarily to help refugee families deal with the trauma that they had to address. Jewish refugee families coming to America, especially in the beginning part of the 20th century, Men came here first and were separated from their wives and their children, particularly for particularly long times, given the Russian Revolution, the First World War, and then the Second World War, and then, of course, that re-entry, the bringing back together of the family, all of whom had undergone their own separate traumatic experiences related to persecution and flight, created a lot of issues for the family. And so that led to this establishment of Jewish family service agencies across the country that are still doing work with refugees today. And the second thing, when Highest started working with refugees in East Africa, in Nairobi, and helped them get resettled to the United States, we realized that the trauma that they had suffered in places like Democratic Republic of the Congo or Somalia was so severe, they really couldn't articulate the basis for their refugee claim. They couldn't really interact with refugee officers because it was re-traumatizing. So we couldn't just provide the legal services to the refugee. We had to also provide the psychosocial services, the basic mental health services to help them be able to just get their stories out and apply for protection and make their case so they can start their lives over again. So again, this is something I think that our communities can learn a great deal from one another.
And, yeah. And one thing I think that Judaism tradition, it combines. It says you can celebrate and you can also mourn at almost the same time. There's a concept of zecher l'churban, remembering the destruction of the temple, and that's more sad things. And then zecher l'mikdash, remembering the temple also, but that's a happy occasion. Rabbi Tuvia Brander mentions this. And especially for children, memory should be happy and joyous and positive. Children, it's got to be fun. It's got to be great. But for adults, it really can be mixed, and it works. And you know, since October 7th was on one of the happiest days of the year, Simchat Torah, Shmiyat Tzeret, and as a rabbi, I remember I said, and our rabbis during the Holocaust also wrote about this, that you can't let the people that want to traumatize you and take away your joy, you can't let them win. So you have to have that. You can't deny the pain, but at the same time, there are the traditions. And the law is that if a close relative dies on the festival, you cannot start the mourning until after the festival, because the Jewish people are celebrating. Even the mourner has to be part of that. And somehow the human condition can do both without denying the joy and without denying the pain and the trauma.
So I want to thank you all for sharing your lenses. I want to thank you particularly for being leaders in your own communities and helping your communities navigate difficult spaces and joyous spaces. I think that what Rabbi Lopatin just talked about, this dichotomy, this balance between joy and sorrow is one of the key elements of us being able to navigate the diasporas that we live in. I want to thank you for your leadership, and I want to thank everyone else here for their leadership as well in this. So being a rabbi, I'll just end with one, as we say, Devar Torah, a piece of spiritual insight. It says Moses is going up on the mountain, and he's having a great time. He's interfacing with God. God is giving him all of the commandments. And then somebody taps him on the shoulder, so euphemistically, and says, "Excuse me, your people are down at the bottom of the mountain. They're rebelling. They're building a golden calf. You got to go take care of it right now. Because even though you're in a very high space right now, you got to go take care of your people." Moses is a little ticked off about this. Goes back down, tells off the people, destroys the calf, breaks the Ten Commandments, and then the other part of Moses kicks in. It's this balance between who and what we are. This balance of who and how we navigate the worlds that we live in. God says to him, "I'm going to destroy all these people because of what they did." Moses goes, "No, no, no, no. Your job was to bring them out, and they're going to be this incredible voice, as the Uyghur people will be in the world, as the Jewish people are and will be in the world. You're going to be this incredible voice. Save them. let's see what we can do to save them and how we're going to get to the next phase. People make errors, as you mentioned, Mark. You make errors sometimes. We make errors sometimes. But our goal is the preservation of who and what we are. And even though there may be evil forces that try to destroy us, we're going to have to be the kind of leaders that both use strength and compassion as the two guiding posts for us to make it to the next step. Thank you so much, and thank you for the organizers of this event.
Thank you to our speakers and moderator. I would encourage everyone to stay in the room as we're now going to have our last panel of the day. We have a terrific lineup of speakers, so I would please welcome the speakers on stage, and then I will invite you all to join the working session. Thank you.
Thank you for the shout out too. Yeah, but that was so powerful. And what you said about Simcha in the morning, that is such a crucial insight that wouldn't have been weighed in here. That comes from halachas. Thank you. And you flew in all the way for this.
Thank you for you. Thank you very much for making it happen.
Say, how are you doing? Off, right? I think all of them are on. I was not in Canada. How are you? Good. Actually in China. I didn't see you in Chiang Mai. Oh, wait, you didn't go there, right? No, I went to the MPSA. Oh, that's where you went. Any place we should go? This is my second time. Yes, as your wish. Yeah, last time was like 6 years ago. Okay, I'll sit next to you. Maybe I should go next time. How are things in Toronto? You're in Toronto, aren't you?
I'm in Ottawa.
You're in Ottawa?
I used to be in Toronto, just I moved because Ottawa is a political capital, so just to save the travel time.
Oh, I see.
So I pronounce your name Fernand Varenes.
De Varenne.
Du Varenes.
No S. S is
Fernand Du Varenes.
Yes. You might as well erase the S. So
Okay.
Easier to remember. I think so. People think sometimes it's Spanish.
I was part of a round table.
Yeah, I see. Okay.
It's for a round table.
Fernand Du Varenes.
De Varenne.
That was actually pretty nice way to do it. When I was in LA for the APSA, because I was presenting, I was so stressed out, preparing my PowerPoint and everything,
So to a certain
The round table, you can just relax and go to all the different panels and with them.
Was it from Tibet, the round table?
There was only one round table. That was the one we were doing. Nothing else.
So it's time to start, or?
Two Tibetans.
Huh? Huh?
Oh, just
Let me
Go again next year. We should be hosting. Please do. Please do. No, that sounds good. I'd definitely consider.
How was MPSA?
Hello. Okay. Let's get started. The time was 2:30, and we're a little past that at the time. So, welcome back to our panel discussion. And my name is Mehmet Tohti, Executive Director of Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project based in Canada, Ottawa, Canada. And topic of our discussion is beyond concentration camps,
forced assimilation and the Chinese colonial boarding schools. Before coming to this point, I would like to make one announcement. And with the contribution of Toronto-based Jewish organization, JIAS, Jewish Immigration Aid Services, we translated Viktor Frankl's famous book, The Man's Search for Meaning, into Uyghur. And JIAS collected nearly $10,000 US for the cost of covering the translation, and we printed 200 copies. So for my Uyghur community members, it is free. You can grab from the hotel. This is a great book. It teaches you how to survive from the horror, from the concentration camp. And it teaches you how to build your resilience. It is a great book. I strongly, strongly recommend for you just to grab one copy. We are talking about residential school or a boarding school. And unfortunately, this is not the topic that we frequently talk about, but it is so important. Even our media organizations do not discuss the boarding school that much. In fact, the boarding school or displacement of children or transferring children from one group to another is one element of genocide. And if you look at the Uyghur tribunal judgment, you will see there's very strong emphasis on the boarding school or residential school. And I would like to remind you why this is so important. The boarding school means disconnection. You are going to disconnect the younger generation from the past. You are going to socially engineer the one people and strip off their original culture, language, identity, tradition, and shape up into different person with different identity and different cultural codes. And for that reason, it is important. And the end goal of the boarding school is colonization and the realization of colonization. And that's exactly what the Chinese government is aiming at when they design and implement the boarding school for Uyghurs and Tibetans. And that is part of genocide. The one component of genocide, just total elimination culturally, religiously, ethnically, or socially. Just transform one ethnic group to another. And for that reason, it is really important. And so we have excellent panels today, from my left to all the way down. Dr. Fernand Varan, just if for mispronunciation, I'm sorry for that. And he is a former UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues, and he is the expert on this topic. And also our friend Tandor Dorji is a senior researcher and a strategist at the Tibetan Action Institute. And we have El-Fadar Iltaber, President of Uyghur American Association, and also Dr. Adrian Zen. And he's our beloved friend and household name for all Uyghurs. And he is a senior fellow and the director of China Studies, Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And so, as I said, and our topic is about the colonial boarding school, and I crafted a number of questions, and because when we say the boarding school, we have to look at the historical context, and we have to compare how it was practiced before and what is the difference of Chinese current practice. and also cultural and social impact. How does the boarding school policy of Chinese government affects or impacts the cultural identity, family dynamics, and the social fabric of Uyghur communities and Tibetans? At the same time, there is a human rights and international law prospect, and so we have to analyze the situation from the human rights perspective, including the potential violation of international laws and the conventions, and also policy rationale and implementation. Can China be successful just transforming Uyghurs into Han Chinese cultures? And lastly, global response and the diplomacy, how we can address that. And so let me keep it short. And let me pose my first question. And if we examine the historical parallels and difference between Chinese policies and the previous instances of boarding schools in colonial context, what can we see it and how we can compare? Let me pose this question first to Adrian and then Tendor.
Yes, thank you very much. So what we're seeing is a very systematic campaign, and when I think about contextualizing the boarding schools among the Uyghurs or targeting the Uyghurs, what I see is that the campaign of mass internment was used as a context to create a state of exceptionalism. And in this particular context, the state turbocharged other policies that are seen as complementary. So the campaign of mass internment was used in a very focused way and then has transitioned into campaigns of continued mass arbitrary detention and imprisonment. But it was used as a focal point to create a long-term change, the long-term disintegration of society. Of course, this mirrors many practices we see around the world, and of course, Tendor can talk about the Tibetan case here. And what I see is that the integration of this policy together with forced labor transfers, which are the component by the state having targeted especially elderly people for long-term imprisonment, especially elites, having targeted especially working age, middle to sort of young age adults for re-education camps, and then targeting the young generation for long-term transformation, resulting in a complete disintegration of Uyghur society. So if you look at this in tandem, which I think is a next level of sophistication compared to other atrocity contexts and colonial boarding schools, including those perpetrated by the West.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Before I open, I actually want to say thank you to all my Uyghur friends here and my Jewish friends, especially the work that the Uyghur community's diaspora leaders have been able to do in the last 5 to 10 years has made a huge impact, a monumental impact on the issue, not only of Uyghur human rights, but also for Tibetans, Mongolians, Chinese, democracy activists. It has benefited so many other human rights issues at under very difficult circumstances for the Uyghur people. And I want to recognize and acknowledge that particular achievement of all of your community. And I think when it comes to the issue of residential schooling as a colonial tool or a colonial policy, I want to focus on one particular aspect of it, which is I know the policy cuts people off parent-child separation. Basically, as much as it is stealing children from their parents and grandparents, it is stealing parents and grandparents from children. So it's committing two major atrocities at the same time in that sense. But sometimes I know when we talk about the importance of language, because we know this policy affects people's, it basically seeks to replace identity of an entire community. It seeks to replace their religious framework, their faith, the community's traditional roots, and of course, the entire linguistic framework of a particular civilization. And sometimes when we talk about language or the loss of language, I think people outside of our community fail to understand what we are talking about. I think people seem to think that language, there was an approach of thinking about language as a tool of communication. And if you lose one language, you gain another language. And you replace one language with another language. And that's the kind of idea that the Chinese government is trying to promote by telling Tibetans and Uyghurs that Tibetan is a language of faith, it's the language of tradition, or they say the same thing to the Uyghur kids, and Chinese is the language of progress, the language of science, right? And the only path to modernity or progress or professional success is through Chinese. That is the entire fundamental, the bottom line of the propaganda that they are trying to tell us. And I think we should completely reject that framing of the argument, because language is not simply a tool. It's a way of being in the world. It's a way of remembering who we are. And for those of us in the diaspora, we always face the challenge of individual people losing their language, as we are immigrants, right? And when an immigrant loses their language, of course, it's a tragedy. But it's not the same thing as a population, an entire society being robbed of its language. And I think we should make that distinction very carefully, because without language, we lose our identity, we lose our memory, and as we heard on the earlier panel, without language, we lose our music, right? You cannot sing Uyghur songs and celebrate Uyghur music in Chinese. I don't think you can do that. So without language, we lose our art, poetry, literature. Without language, the civilization collapses, right? And I think that's what we are seeing right now. And finally, just to add quickly, I try to, whenever I see somebody who is coming back from Tibet, I try to ask them, what did you see? What's happening, right? And it's very few people make it in there. And those who do, if you ask them, over the last couple of years, I have heard again and again and again from people who have been inside. They're saying, okay, I went to Eastern Tibet. All the children below 10 years of age are talking to each other in Chinese. And I hear from people who went to Central Tibet in Lhasa, and they're telling me, all the kids who are below 15 or 16 years, they're all talking to each other in Chinese, right? This has never happened before in several thousand years of Tibetan history. And I know it's the same for the Uyghur issue as well. And this is very dangerous, because the way language dies is a little bit different from the way a religion might die. It's a bit different from the way that ethnicity might die. There's no blood spilled the way language dies. What happens is children become second language speakers of your native tongue, right? So Tibetan first becomes second language for many of these kids, and all of a sudden, it becomes a dead language. It doesn't go from second language to third language and fourth language. It doesn't take more than 2 or 3 generations, the way the Chinese government has designed this policy. Within 2 generations, the job is over. And it's the same for the Uyghurs and same for the Tibetans. And I think that's something we should treat very urgently, because there is something intangible about the death or about the murder of a language. And that's the part that I wanted to make a point today. Thank you.
Thank you. As we mentioned, there is a cultural aspect of the boarding school. In my home country, Canada, we discuss frequently on Canada's previous practice of residential boarding school. In fact, Canada declared its own practice of boarding school as a genocide, because, as I mentioned, it is one of the elements of Genocide Convention, transferring children from one group to another, and established Truth and the Reconciliation Committee, and that committee spent more than $20 billion. Now they try to encourage the young, the first generation, young first generation, just to learn their languages. So far, not successful, because one culture raised, it is most likely permanently gone. And for that reason, it is really important. And so I would like to invite Al-Fidar just to join our conversation here. And so when we talk about the social and the cultural impact, it is about loss of identity, erasure of culture and the tradition and all of that. And so how the Uyghur communities at large and Uyghur Americans experience that kind of disconnection, that kind of the state mobilization of raising the cultural and the social identity of Uyghurs.
Thank you, Mehmet. And I would like to start with my speech by thanking for the organizers of this event. Honored to be here. I believe I was privileged and lucky to grow up in a patriotic Uyghur family. I was born in East Turkestan and left my hometown when I was 11. So I went to Uyghur school. I grew up talking about Uyghur history during the dinner table, at dinner time. And I was always proud about our culture, our history. I believe like love, compassion, trust, happiness, those are the values children first learn in their families, within the families. And that's how the children's identity and their character builds and form. And unfortunately, because of the Chinese government's genocidal policies, Uyghur children are living and growing up without those moral principles these days. The Chinese government's genocidal policy intend to destroy Uyghur children's identity, their language, their religion, their culture. When the headlines made the international media about millions of Uyghurs taken to the concentration camps, and I was worried about the children as a mother, as a human rights activist, and what's going on and what's happening to the children. Later on, we learned that children are also stolen and taken to state-run orphanages, boarding schools, and kindergartens, and they too, away from their family, away from the love and compassion and happiness, away from their identity, their religion, their cultural background, and basically re-engineered into loyal CCP subject by the Chinese government. While children are chanting CCP slogans in those boarding schools, their parents were also doing the same thing in the concentration camps, the forced labor camps, and prisons. And Chinese government knew this very well, and that's why their intent was to destroy the familial bond, to destroy our future. By separating children from their families, they were destroying our hope, our world. Basically, the state-imposed forced boarding schools were tearing us apart. And also, Adrian Zenz mentioned the forced labor, and that's another tool of transferring Uyghurs to inner China and separating the families. So those mothers, fathers, and as you know, first our scholars, intellectuals were arrested, right? The writers, the artists, the singers, and teachers, professors. They are away from their families. That way, these backbone of the society, those tradition bearers, are captured and away from the children, so they cannot transform their culture, their language, their religion, their identity, basically Uyghur identity, to children's. And that's what's going on back home. And this is very dangerous. I worried about our future, and our children's are at stake, our future are at stake. What we need to do, I think we're gonna talk about this later, but we have a lot of responsibilities in the diaspora. For the children in the diaspora should learn their language, their identity, and their culture very well. And we should preserve and promote those values, those cultural values, historical knowledge, and educate ourselves well to continue those, because we're very afraid that the Chinese government is intent to erase and eradicate Uyghur culture, Uyghur identity in our homeland. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, when we talk about the boarding school or residential school policy, actually we know that there is enough precedence from the different jurisdictions. They had that the practice before, and some countries issued state apology for their past policy. And for that reason, as we said, because the colonial boarding school raised the issue of not only the colonization, at the same time, it was intended to erase the group, so it raised some legal questions as well. And we have a lot of international conventions, and also we have a human rights law, international law. From that perspective, what you can share with us, Dr. Fernand.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You'll have to excuse me. I think I've caught a cold. Thank you, Mehmet Rahmat. Let me begin with some pop culture. You have heard perhaps the expression, "He who shall not be named," from the famous Harry Potter movie series. Sometimes I get the impression that we should name what is occurring in China, in Xinjiang, and also in Tibet, as not only a phenomenon of a series of massive violations of human rights, but something much bigger, in fact, much more systematic. And we've heard a few references to that, but we're seeing, I think we have to recognize what it is and name what is happening. And the name is the process of colonization, erasure, and elimination of a civilization and a people in China. In fact, more than one. I would say this is actually occurring also with Tibetans, with Uyghurs, and perhaps also with the Hui and a few other minorities. What we are seeing is a form of Han nationalism, adopting a series of measures that involve massive violations of international human rights, as I'll mention later on, but it's part of a bigger picture. And we need to recognize that bigger picture to understand why, what is motivating and pushing this agenda involving millions of people, separating hundreds of thousands of families, and so on. Now, as has been mentioned previously, and if I can put this in context, a number of independent experts of the United Nations, and also the former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, have issued a number of reports, communications, responses to allegations of massive violations. And many of us are quite disturbed by the scale of what is happening, but also the level of atrocity and grave violations of human rights involved. For example, we all know of the situation of the massive internment of between 1 and 2 million Uyghurs, and also some other minorities in large-scale arbitrary detention. And by the way, this is probably the largest detention of civilian population since the Second World War. And I don't think we acknowledge and emphasize the scale, the massive violations of rights that are involved. Because it is about, or was about 10 or 20% of the adult population, I think, in Xinjiang at the time. One of my colleagues, when I was still Special Rapporteur, I'm now retired, happily, I might add, the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, Mr. Tomoya Obokata, who concluded just a few years ago in 2022 that in Tibet and Xinjiang, Chinese authorities had put in place systems which subjected Tibetans and Uyghurs to forced labor, which, because of its involuntary nature and the nature and extent of the powers, exercised on them not only as individuals, but also as communities, that this could amount to a modern form of slavery. Forced labor, definitely, perhaps even a form of modern slavery. And that in this day and age, this may be occurring in such a massive scale is absolutely shocking. In a communication of myself and a few other colleagues last September, as a matter of fact, quite recently, we expressed grave concerns over allegations of a significant expansion of Xinjiang's state-run boarding school system, which has been mentioned, which fails to provide education in a child's mother tongue, but essentially, forcibly, and most importantly, forcibly separates hundreds of thousands, perhaps even 800,000, mainly Uyghur children, from their families. 800,000. I think we were amongst the first at the United Nations to highlight this. And that, to me, is quite surprising, shocking, and unacceptable. Children, hundreds of thousands of children, separated from their families for most of their lives, removed completely from not only their family, but their language, their culture, their history, their heritage. Now, there is a past of that, when indigenous peoples in many parts of the world, including this country, were separated from their families with the intentional policy of destroying their cultures, of destroying them as a people with a distinct identity. How is what is happening to the Uyghur, and now also the Tibetans, by the way, different from what was being done to the indigenous people? In fact, it's not. It is clearly with the same intent of destroying a civilization, a people, by removing future generations from any direct contact, learning about their history, their language, their cultures, their religions also. This is what we're facing. And quite frankly, until a few decades ago, one would have thought that that period of inhumane cultural genocide was revolved, was finished. But we're seeing it today in a more modern form, but in a very systematic way. And here's where the problem is. It is a series, there's a massive series of human rights violations in international law, and I will add a few others. But sometimes we miss the forest by focusing too much on the trees. What is happening in Xinjiang and in Tibet is not just a series of massive violations of human rights, it's part of an intentional direction, a colonization process, yes, also various measures to, in fact, make sure that the Uyghur language, culture, history, traditions are not actually transmitted as clearly as that. And it's actually quite astounding what is being done, once again, fairly systematically when you start enumerating them. There are claims of sterilization of Uyghur and other minority women, as many of you will know, the banning of certain Muslim names, the restrictions on the teaching of Islam, as you know, to new generations. Books focusing on the Uyghur homeland and ancient Uyghur literature have been banned for decades. More recently and more generally, even books of poetry, by the way, is dangerous if it is published in Uyghur language. We've heard the elites quite often are targeted and prosecuted and imprisoned. We are hearing that essentially the Uyghur language really has essentially disappeared from the school system. Many books and libraries also have been removed. The destruction of mosques and historical sites, and even of cemeteries. And by the way, that's one of the methods to erase the presence of a people on a territory. You get rid of the cemeteries. This is not an accident. This is part of a very systematic approach to erase a civilization and a people and its history and presence on a territory. There's the expropriation of traditional and pastoral lands. It started decades ago with the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps. But all of this is meant to control the resources in many aspects of social and economic life and to favor the ethnic Han over indigenous Uyghur. You have the insertion, some of you may not know this, the insertion of Han and other Chinese into Uyghur families under the United as One Family program. I have to say that with a certain cringe, quite frankly, if you understand what it means. All of these involve massive interference in private life, in family life, it in fact freedom of expression, discriminatory, and so on. So all of that to say that we need to understand that what we're dealing with here is not only a series of massive violations of international human rights, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, right to family life, right to privacy, non-discrimination, but it also is part of a systematic approach with the objective of colonizing, controlling the land and resources, erasing the visibility, presence, and history of a civilization and people over their own lands, which they have occupied for hundreds, in fact, more than 1,000 years. And this is where I think we need to be honest. We need to name the evil for what it is. We need to name he who shall not be named, because unless we name also the systematic objectives that is involved, I think we are only going to be dealing with separate trees and forget the bigger picture. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you so much. So let's go back to Dr. Adrian Sands. And so if we look at the official reasoning behind this policy from the Chinese government's perspective, what we are seeing right now, what is just the reason of the Chinese government or excuse? What's the narrative of Chinese government? Because I know that you did some research and that 800,000 Uyghur children's removal from the community to the state-sanctioned orphanages, it was a result of your research. And so if you can shed a light on that. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. As I had said before, it is incredible how the Chinese state came in already in 2016 to unleash an entire package of coercive measures. And this was very much premeditated, as I've argued, through policy experimentation. Various of these policies were gradually developed, and then the state of exception created by the mass internments was used to turbocharge, to supercharge some of these incredible policies. But when Chen Quanguo, the previous party secretary responsible for the atrocities, came to Xinjiang in 2016, he came with a plan that he knew basically he had 7 months. 7 months before the mass internments would be unleashed to prepare the ground. And it's very telling that one of these measures that he was very busy preparing to prepare this campaign was not just, besides massive police recruitments, besides the surveillance state, he embarked on a military style, and I'm using a literal word from the Chinese documents, a military style campaign to transform the education system. In September 2016, just 1 month after ascending to power, he proposed a massively accelerated preschool campaign. And originally, the plan was to advance the goal of 3 years of universal preschool education by the end of the 5-year period at the end of 2020. That would have taken about 5 years. Chen Quanguo told his officials that they had to finish this by 2017, by the autumn of 2017. So a preschool, a massive preschool, and we're talking full-time preschooling, boarding-style preschooling in most cases, that was going to take at least 5 years, gradually unfolding as we saw it in Tibet, in Tibetan regions. He wanted that to be done in less than 12 months. The original plan also only called for 80% preschool enrollment of children aged 4 to 6 by 2020. He said by the fall of 2017, you need to have 100%. 100% preschool enrollment. By the late February 2017, Xinjiang began to construct nearly 5,000 quote-unquote bilingual preschools with a planned intake of over 560,000 new students, focused, of course, on the Uyghur homeland in the south. Now, speaking about intentionality here, a January 2018 document, which incredibly enough has been published, or was published at the time when I did my research, called the Xinjiang Youth Development Plan 2017-20, openly spoke of the need to support minors who are not sufficiently cared for by the government. Now, among these groups of children that needed to be cared for by the government were various categories that you also find in other provinces in China. But there was one category that a comparison to other provincial documents was only listed in the Uyghur region, namely the minors of persons in detention and of re-education trainees. In 2018, Xinjiang embarked on the campaign to centralize boarding schooling. A document from Kashgar Prefecture from August 2018 started that by 2020, the goal of completing construction of dormitory-based schools was to be done. For grades 4 and higher, boarding was mandatory, but as we see in the south and in Hotan, for example, it was even enforced for preschoolers. Now, the government statistics that my colleague here has already mentioned, that between 2017 and 19, the number of boarding students in primary and middle schools, grades 1 to 9, increased by nearly 80%, from 498,000 to 880,500. At the same time, the number of floor space per school decreased, grew significantly, while the number of schools decreased. So what they did is centralizing. They were closing down schools that were not boarding schools and actively creating huge super schools. And these huge super schools, combining middle and primary schooling, were highly securitized. Internal government documents, alluded to here, show that in just one region, over 10,000 Uyghur children in quote-unquote hardship due to one or both parents detained, and 10% with both parents in detention. Many of them, according to the spreadsheet, put into state orphanages. Propaganda reports openly saying that a so-called vocational skills education training center, a re-education camp, had a preschool and a school. It says the children eat and live for free at these schools, and their parents can work in the factories near the camp, while the children are taken care of at the preschool. The re-education camp also even had its own nursery for very small children below preschool age. And it said specifically that the school and the nursery were only 2 minutes away from the associate factories. So the combination, and these are all accessible data. The state itself talking about these campaigns, using them in tandem, and I think the important fact, and this might come out in a Q&A, the boarding schooling is the long-term plan, the plan of long-term destruction. And within the literature on settler colonialism, you have the concept of genocidal attrition, meaning you're achieving a form of genocide through a long-term attrition that can happen by undermining the health of a population, as we saw with a lot of native Indian populations, not providing health care, or it can take other forms and shapes. I think this is the reality that the region is facing right now. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have 15 minutes left, so if we can finish on time. So 3 panelists, just if I can give them just 5 minutes each. Just let me go back to Tandor. And so we talked about the Xinjiang, and Xinjiang is relevant to Tibet as well because he transferred from Tibet to East Turkestan. And also there is a report that nearly 1 million Tibetans also going through now the boarding school in Tibet. And also I read the report that the Chinese government intentionally creates some sort of superior condition for Tibetan children at school, so when they go back in a weekend to visit their family members, so they insisted just to go back to boarding school again because of the meals or other superior conditions. So my question for you is China succeeding in that boarding school, just transforming the Tibetan children into a mainland or mainstream Han Chinese society?
Thank you. I'm really sad to express the opinion that I really think China has been quite successful so far. Unfortunately, they have a couple of advantages, and I think one advantage they have, which the historical boarding schools, residential schools in North America did not, is the technological advantage. And I think they also have the advantage of scale and state capacity. And with those things, the level of surveillance they have, what they have been able to do is really compress time in such a way that just within a handful of years, what we are seeing right now in Tibet is children who hate their own community, children who refuse to talk to their parents, basically Tibetans who are growing up as self-hating Tibetans. And we are seeing empirical evidence of that in the minute. I have heard about, there was this slogan that I heard that Chinese teachers use to kind of express what they worry about when once in a while these children go back home for 2 days of the weekend. When they used to have that policy, the teachers said, actually this doesn't work because we are fighting the battle of 5 plus 2 equals 0. So what this means from their perspective is for 5 days a week, they try to turn the Tibetan children into Chinese subjects, not citizens, right? Because citizenship comes with rights. Tibetans and Uyghurs do not have any rights, so they are subjects of the Chinese government. So 5 days a week, they try to do that, and then 2 days of the weekend, they go home, and they interact with their parents in Tibetan once again. And what the teachers are saying is, those 2 days are eroding the results of what we have accomplished over the course of 5 days, so they canceled. They created new policy forbidding children from going home for the weekend. And this has been quite devastatingly effective, but in spite of China's technological advantages that they're using right now, I think they do also have a disadvantage compared to the historical schools out here. And I think that disadvantage is they have a legal international law disadvantage. 100 years ago, many of the international law frameworks did not exist. The concept of human rights, the concept of self-determination, indigenous rights, many of these frameworks did not exist back then, and they were unable to protect what happened to the indigenous communities out here. But right now, these legal frameworks do exist, and we do have institutions that never existed before. And if we are able to use the way we have been able to leverage some of these institutions, I think there is a chance to actually stop this. So I don't think the story is over yet.
If I may add my perspective on this, for Uyghur children in those boarding schools, state-run orphanages, they are going to graduate somehow, right, grow up, but they will have those psychological impact on them, because when they speak Uyghur, they're punished, and when they're trying to be themselves, they're punished. So those going to have some negative memories in their mind, and when they grow up, I think they will still face discrimination because they're Chinese-speaking, Chinese-thinking, CCP loyal subjects, but they're Uyghur-looking. And the Chinese government will still, Chinese people, and government still discriminate them. And they will feel that again, and then maybe go back to their identity again, search their ancestry, search for their identity. So I have slightly hope in there for the Uyghurs. I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you for that additional comment. So let me come back to Dr. Fernando Varanas, or Varan. And so now This story of boarding school and research and documentations are widely shared, and I believe it is within the awareness of some policymakers, if not all. And so in this way or that way, the global community should respond this way or that way, through diplomacy or by using the international conventions or so other tools. So when we discuss about international community's reaction, including the diplomatic relations and human rights or advocacy or potential legal actions against Chinese government, what can you tell us about that?
Thank you very much. Well, the reaction has been way too timid, quite frankly. We are talking about children, and if international human rights is supposed to protect anyone, it should be protecting children. We have a treaty, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which fundamentally says that the child belongs to the family, as a member of the family. What I find very striking, and what needs to be absolutely corrected, is that this should be one of the critical main issues that the international community should seize when you have hundreds of thousands of children, because of their ethnic, religious, or linguistic background, removed from their families. And what is, to me, as I said, surprising is that this really hasn't happened very much. As a special rapporteur, myself and other colleagues were the first one to, I think, within the international community, the United Nations, to really raise the issue first of the Tibetans a few years ago, and then the Uyghur children. And after that occurred, and with the Uyghurs, this is only last year, remember, I had some diplomats in Geneva actually say, we did not know. I'm sorry, there is something absolutely missing here. And when it comes to children who are amongst the most vulnerable members of society, where it is clear that they are targeted because of their ethnic, religious background, linguistic background, where it is clear also there is a massive situation of discrimination, even you could describe what is happening in some aspects, racial discrimination. So the Convention Against All Forms of Racial Discrimination is applicable. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is applicable. You have a huge number of treaties, and yet, to my knowledge, most of the UN Human Rights committees have not looked directly and responded to what is happening there. So there's a huge amount more that can be done in terms of the international human rights mechanisms. There needs to be much greater awareness raising, because I honestly do not think it's happening sufficiently within the UN institutions and mechanism. I know that there's a great deal of work done at the national level, and I think one has to commend many who have been involved in raising this visibility. But here I have to be slightly pessimistic. I am an optimist by nature, but in this case, let me just say, we only have a few generations to try to change this. If you allow the Chinese government to continue for 1, 2 more generations, much will be lost and perhaps unrecoverable. So there has to be a great focus of effort, resources, lobbying, diplomatic channels, but also making sure the international community, the United Nations in particular, does its job. The UN has been extremely timid, I have to say, in this area where there is no excuse when you're dealing with children. And in fact, we can say the situations of genocide. I always hesitate to use that word, but in this case, one has to look at what is really the objective here of the government. Thank you.
Thank you. And just a last point for future projections and possible solutions. At the end, as the Uyghur organizations and activists and member of academia and all level, we have to focus on the finding solutions, and we have to resist. And in that sense, at the community level, this question for Elfidar, so how we can make this issue to the priority in our community first. As I complained at the beginning, Uyghur communities, we are not talking about just boarding school. And at the Radio Free Asia is not talking too much about boarding school, but it is ongoing. That tragedy is unfolding right now. And so how we can bring this issue to our own agenda first? What we're supposed to do? Thank you.
Time is the essence, as you mentioned. It's really important. I didn't mention about forced marriages because we're talking about boarding school, but that's another danger that is coming, that Chinese government is intent to assimilate Uyghurs. So the future, the children are born, will they identify themselves Chinese or Uyghur, most likely Chinese? So this is very important that we need to focus on, as you mentioned, Mehmet. So what can we do as individuals, as an organizations? I believe first thing to do is to document and monitor what's going on and educate ourselves. So collect the videos, the testimonies, the documented, leaked documents, right? Satellite images of those boarding schools and educate ourselves what's really going on and why it's going to impact our future. And then raise awareness events just like this right now in universities, in interfaith groups, churches, and synagogues and mosques, and create coalition groups basically and alliance. For example, right now we have one coalition to end Uyghur boarding school program policies in China, and with the Tibetan groups and also Southern Mongolians. We're trying to do more online work for now, but we can extend that coalition, for example, and include more civil society groups, more human rights groups, and prioritize this because this is one area that is not taking much attention at the moment, but the danger is in near future. Besides that, you mentioned the lawmakers can make difference. We need to, each one of us, write to our Congress members, our senators, and UN, and all the law firms to explore the ways, the avenues to take a legal action on this. So I think organizations has responsibility to start those kind of initiatives. As individuals, we can write, as a mother, as a father, we can write letters to respective big legal organizations and lawmakers. And I believe those are the avenues. Basically, what's going on in China to Uyghurs is like a story of me, and happening to Tibet. We need to make this story of us. As a collective way, we need to take initiatives and actions to make this story a story of all our future, because that is what's at stake. Thank you.
Thank you. This is the end of this wonderful panel. I would like to thank each and every one of our wonderful panelists. And the topic is important, and I hope this topic will continue to stay on the top of our community agenda and organizational agenda, and we have to keep pushing because we have enough documentations and we need to act, and there are countries can relate this boarding school to their own past history, so there could be more possibility to gain more support. So let's hope just to work a little bit more on this, and just with our community discussion, how we can mobilize our community effort just to bring this issue on the top of our own agenda first, and then to the agenda of other international actors. Thank you.
Thank you to our speakers. This brings us to the end of day one. I will invite the speakers and the speakers of the previous panel to the working session in the next room. And for the rest of us, I would also encourage all of you to purchase these tote bags to stand with Uyghurs, and the t-shirts here, as well as support Uyghur restaurants that are on this flyer. Just, you can find this information at the registration desk. The rest of us, you have 2 hours free time, so you can do what you want. And we have a public reception, open reception at 5:30 here, so you can come back here for 5:30. See you all soon. Thank you.